I understand every word. You're saying single dad fluently responds to billionaire's German insults. Marcus Hale had learned German the hard way. The way most things worth knowing are learned. Not in a classroom with textbooks and flashcards, but in a cold apartment in Stuttgart 17 years ago, when he was 22 years old and completely alone and so broke that he had eaten plain rice for 11 days straight before his first paycheck arrived, and he had learned it because he had no choice, because the city did not speak his. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of small moments to change lives, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness True Stories. Also, tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from. Language, and he did not speak its language. And there was a boy back home in Ohio, his nephew Danny, who was only 3 years old, and whose mother, Marcus's older sister Claire, had just died in a car accident on a wet highway in October. And Marcus had gone to Germany on a 2-year engineering contract because the money was 3 times what he could earn at home, and Danny needed stability, and a home, and someone who would fight for him. And so Marcus had fought quietly and without complaint, learning German word by word, phrase by phrase, until the language sat in his mouth as naturally as his own, until he dreamed in it sometimes, until he could argue with a landlord or comfort a neighbor or read a bedtime story in it without thinking twice. And then he had come home to Ohio with enough money to buy a small house and file for legal guardianship of Danny, who was by then 5 years old, and called Marcus Dad because that was simply what he was. And Marcus had gone back to working regular engineering jobs. Not glamorous ones, practical ones, the kind that kept the lights on and Danny in good shoes and the mortgage paid. And the German had sat quietly inside him like a book on a shelf, used occasionally, mostly forgotten by the world around him, until the morning he walked into the lobby of Hargrove Tower for a job interview. That could change everything, because the lead engineering position at Hargrove Industries paid 4 times his current salary and came with benefits and a stability that would mean Danny, now 19 and starting community college, would never have to worry again. And Marcus had worn his best shirt and his one good blazer, and he had arrived 12 minutes early, the way his mother had always told him to. And the lobby was the kind of lobby that was designed to make a person feel small. All marble and glass, and the particular silence of enormous wealth. And at the reception desk, a young woman had told him that Mr. Hargrove was running late and that he should wait in the executive lounge on the 14th floor. And Marcus had thanked her and taken the elevator up and found the lounge, a room of leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there were 2 other men already in the room, both in suits that cost more than Marcus's monthly mortgage payment. And they were speaking German to each other, rapidly and without lowering their voices, clearly assuming that the man in the slightly worn blazer sitting quietly with his hands folded could not understand a word they were saying. And what they were seeing was not kind, the taller one, whose name Marcus would later learn was Friedrich Hargrove, the billionaire's eldest son, and the man who would be sitting in on the interview, was saying to his companion that this next candidate looked like a janitor who had wandered into the wrong building, and that his father had a weakness for hiring people who looked like charity cases, and that he personally intended to end the interview in under 10 minutes. And his companion laughed and said that the man's shoes alone disqualified him. And Friedrich said yes, and the suit looks like he borrowed it from a cousin. And they both laughed again, with the easy cruelty of men who have never had to think carefully about money. And Marcus sat and listened to every word with the stillness of someone who has survived genuinely hard things and therefore cannot be touched by small ones. And when Friedrich finally turned to him with a performance of polite surprise, as if only just noticing him, and said in English with a slight accent, "You must be the candidate. How do you do?" Marcus stood and extended his hand and replied in German, fluent and calm and without a trace of anger. He said in German, "I do very well, thank you, and I understand every word you just said." And the room went so quiet that Marcus could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling, and Friedrich's face did something complicated, moving through surprise and then embarrassment and then a kind of calculation. And his companion suddenly found something very interesting to look at through the window, and Marcus continued in German, unhurried, saying that he had lived in Stuttgart for 2 years and that he had worked alongside German engineers for most of his career, and that he spoke the language well enough to have discussed load-bearing tolerances and thermal expansion coefficients in it on more than one occasion, and that if Friedrich wanted to continue the conversation in German, he was entirely comfortable doing so. And Friedrich stared at him for a long moment and then did something Marcus had not expected. He laughed, not the cruel laugh from before, but a real one, surprised out of him. And he said in English, "Well then, I suppose we should go find my father." And the interview that Friedrich had planned to end in 10 minutes lasted 2.5 hours. And it was not Friedrich who conducted most of it, but his father, Gerhard Hargrove, a compact, serious man in his 70s, who had built his company from a machine parts workshop and who asked Marcus questions that were specific and technical and demanding, and Marcus answered every one of them because he knew the work. He had always known the work. The work was never the problem. And at one point Gerhard asked him in German, just to test it, a complex question about material fatigue in high-temperature environments. And Marcus answered in German precisely and at length, and Gerhard sat back in his chair and looked at his son with an expression that needed no translation. And at the end of the meeting, Gerhard shook Marcus's hand and said they would be in touch very soon. And on the elevator ride down, Friedrich stood beside Marcus and after a moment said quietly, "In German, I apologize for what I said in the lounge." And Marcus looked at him and said, "Also in German, I appreciate that." And Friedrich said, "Where did you learn to speak like that?" And Marcus said, "Necessity." And Friedrich nodded slowly as if he understood that necessity was its own kind of teacher, perhaps the best kind. And Marcus walked out through the marble lobby and into the afternoon sunlight and called Danny, who answered on the second ring the way he always did. And Marcus said, "I think it went well." And Danny said, "Dad, it always goes well when you show up." And Marcus laughed and stood on the pavement outside a building made of glass and wealth and thought about a cold apartment in Stuttgart and 11 days of plain rice and a 3-year-old boy who needed someone to fight for him. And he thought that every hard thing he had ever walked through had been preparation for exactly this. Not for the job, though the job would come. The offer arrived 4 days later. But for the moment in that lounge, when 2 men had looked at his worn blazer and decided he did not belong, and he had sat quietly and known something they did not know, which was that belonging has nothing to do with the cost of your shoes and everything to do with what you have carried and what you have learned and what you chose to do on the days when it would have been easier not to try. If this story gave you chills and put a smile on your face, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Kindness True Stories, where every story reminds you that quiet strength always speaks louder than loud arrogance. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that might just change your day. Thank you for watching and for being part of this incredible community.